How's everybody doing today? Finishing off the week the way I began with more impromptu streams. This one actually I probably could have planned around. Hey, RPG Grandma, you are early, or I'm late. One of the two. I haven't done one of these in a while. I just found that once I kind of stopped redditing, I found that what did I say the mines from which I would gather material, the dirt, the soil from which the bloggish flutes would grow, just seemed to wither a little bit, or maybe I found my interest withering. I'm not quite sure, but I still like to do these. And today, I actually had time today, but what I did do was there was a while back I talked about it. The alchemy RPG folks in I was gonna say in collusion, but that makes it sound like a horrible thing in partnership with Free League are running these sort of demos, intros to using Alchemy RPG with different Free League products. They did Vason before. I think I talked about that, and I went and I actually did did a bit of a demo with Alchemy and Vason after the fact, and they did one today for what Tales from the Loop. Same thing. So it's I guess these demos, these walkthroughs are kind of half, they're sort of divided. I don't know if it's quite equal in time. Half about alchemy, and then the platform, and just generally just how the platform works and all that stuff, and then another half on sort of the game, in this case Tales from the Loop, and a bit about game specific stuff on alchemy, and they're great. But I signed up for a 1 o'clock time slot, which, given that I like to do a lot of streaming at 1 o'clock, probably wasn't the best idea. Number one. And number 2, I had forgotten they're kinda long, and especially which wouldn't be a problem except for that the first half, the front half in which they're going through alchemy is not new to me anymore, so it's not, they're sort of going over the ground, and I'm not so, expert in the system that I couldn't use a bit of refresher, but, it ends up being something I don't know, overall, I don't know if the overall was about 90 minutes or 2 hours, 90 minutes to 2 hours, but a little bit of an investment of time, and then after that, just kinda decompressing, getting away from the computer a bit, and then suddenly it's like, "Oh my gosh, what happened to the day?" Next time, I'll probably try to plan it a little differently, but I didn't anticipate my day shaking out the way it did, which is that I could have done it if there was an earlier morning session or some other way. I probably could have done that instead and then had the middle part of the day, but it's not like they're running these things back to back to back to back all day long. So, but it was good, and I did it, and now I have Tales from the Loop in my alchemy, and now I'm getting a bit more used to it. I don't know what ultimately I'm gonna do. I feel like I wanna do some stuff with it because, they're essentially gifting, the folks who attend with the content on alchemy, which gets, I think it's $30 charge for the core book, something like that, so I kinda wanna do something with it. Whether that's another sort of run through demo or something else, I'm not sure. I need to go back and really look through the Tales from the Loop books, which I have digitally. I don't think I have anything physical from that. That was my day. Hope your day has been going well. I did gather some blog pieces, as we can see here, stuff that I thought was interesting. I'm mostly pulling from the OSR Discord these days. They have a blog roll channel where you could post up. So I've been grabbing from there. As usual, if folks have stuff, I would much rather get it from folks in the community directly instead of me sifting through things to find. And oftentimes, it's just I just try to find stuff which I think is interesting to me. Hopefully, other folks find it interesting. So there's some stuff that just doesn't either appeal to me, or it's about a system I don't really care about, or there are certain topics I don't care that much about. Like, even I don't mind reading about fifth edition stuff, but if it's fifth edition character optimization articles, it's not for me. That kind of thing, right? But I found a few. Not sure how long it'll take if we'll get through all of them, but I always thought better to have more than not enough. This one is from the Draw the Rest of the Owlbear blog, and it's called "You Can't Elide What Doesn't Exist." Now, there's been some talk off and on. It's been on the Discord. I don't know if it's migrated other places, whether you've seen it or not, this idea, this concept. And I'm not going to, maybe I should read it. All right, let me read the original article. And I'm going to say original, this article that kind of, I don't know, sort of blew up a little bit. from, well, let me exit full screen mode, maybe see everything. This is from jared.blot.im talking about rules allied and its consequences. Now, this is it's an interesting concept. I'm not sure I totally agree with it in all cases, but I think as a general thing, it's good. So I'll read it and it'll just give us the context for this other piece. But I think it's good. I probably should have read it earlier because I did think it was interesting when I ran across it, but just other things were going on and I didn't read it. And if you see me kind of doing stuff like this, it's because I did something on my shoulder and it's kind of I'm in a touch bit of pain, not constant pain, but every once in a while I'll move it in a certain direction and suddenly I feel soreness. So you may see that. Brian Smith says, "What the heck does allied even mean?" Well, I think we'll talk about it. So let's get into it. Rules allied and its consequences. This is a thing I say about TTRPG design, rules allied. It's the product of having the same conversation dozens or hundreds of times and needing some way to shortcut it whenever possible. It points to a way of conceiving of the job of the quote unquote game designer that is at once counterintuitive and, if you're me, obviously and magnificently true. I'm sure you'll all disagree. I don't care, but I've had a few people show up in my DMs, etc., recently asking what I mean by rules allied and how that can possibly be true. So I figured I'd attempt to summarize a bit here. At the very least, this way people can be confused by me more comprehensively. So uh, it doesn't mean ignoring the rules. Well, I'll get into it, but essentially, well, let's just read it because he's got a good example here that I think we'll make it clear. Maybe. The basic idea, let's pick a lock. To say that rules allied is to say that they do nothing else, that they cannot do anything else. Rules do not themselves create or conjure or elicit or inspire or invoke or incite. They only negate. This is a strong formulation. You don't have to agree with it to read this or benefit from it, but it helps. This is easiest to explain by example. Example one. Maybe, let me zoom in here a little bit too. Oh, interesting. If you zoom in, you lose full screenness. Okay. Example one. The characters approach a door and they decide to open it. It is locked. One character produces a set of lock picks from their pack, and they describe in minute detail the way they apply it to the lock. Quote, I feel for the first pin, applying pressure with the tensioner, the player says. The GM responds, it moves freely. They continue this tense back and forth until, for one pin, the GM responds, it sticks slightly into the outer barrel. You feel the cylinder click slightly in the direction of the tension. After some time, the character has managed to line up every set of pins with the cylinder, and the lock slides open. Later, the characters encounter another lock, but this one has a trap pin. The feedback the GM provides them is contradictory and confusing because they don't know how a trap pin works. After a long time spent unsuccessfully describing how they attempt to pick it, they decide that it's not worth the time and effort and they leave, taking a different path through the dungeon. The lock picking character decides that they will ask around at the local seedy tavern for tips and tricks about dealing with especially pesky locks like this one. Let's see. RPG Grandma says to surprises are altered by elision to strike out or to leave out of consideration. Yes. And we're going to be getting to it. I promise. I promise it's going to be made maybe slightly clear. Hey, the Dave, welcome. Example two. The characters approach a door and they decide to open it. It is locked. One character produces a set of lock picks from their pack and says, I attempt to pick the lock. The GM responds, flip a coin. If it's heads, you're successful. It is heads, and the party proceeds through the newly unlocked door. Later, the characters encounter another lock. They flip a coin and it comes up tails. This lock is more difficult, apparently. They leave, taking a different path through the dungeon. So those two examples, the first one would be with a lack of rules. There are no rules, so we're literally working our way through the fiction using our shared knowledge of locks, or at least even potentially not even shared locks, to get through it, right? In the second one, there is a mechanic. In this case, it's very dead simple one, flipping a coin, but there is a rule. And so what he's going to say in a second, and what we're kind of getting at, what he's getting at here is that the rule, which is flip a coin to pick a lock, elides over the going through all the mechanical step by steps for opening the lock. So the difference between examples 1 and 2 above is the introduction of a rule. Example 1 has no rule, or no game rule at least. The only rules governing lock picking there in the fiction of play are those same ones that govern it here in the terrible world that we inhabit with our human bodies. As a result, this bit of play is about picking a lock. In every way, a bit of play can be about picking a lock. Everything is relevant, everything is important, everything must be accounted for. It's all play. Example 2 uses a rule to remove from play all those bits that players might find boring or unimportant. It does not, I repeat, it does not remove quote unquote lock picking from play. It merely removes those parts of the process of lock picking that are not relevant to the way the players wish to play. Pins and cylinders and tumblers and picks and tensioners and trap pins and so on. Removing these things from play allows the players to focus on other things more directly. For instance, the contextual, fictional consequences of successfully or unsuccessfully picking this lock. Dave wants to catch opinions on skills or no skills for a game. Ooh, Dave, let me get through this article and then I'll come back on that one because that is definitely a question that is worth, or a topic I should say, it's worth talking about, but probably not in the center of this, in the middle of this article. Um, okay, so do we have that? What they mean here by rules eliding, right? We have all these mechanisms around processes around picking a lock, but we decide that instead of engaging with all these little processes, we're going to instead make a rule, which is flip a coin in this case to open the lock or not. Here's a more thoroughgoing explanation. Mortal Kombat. We can conceive of rules elision happening fractally at different scales. This becomes more visible when we look at combat in RPGs as a more subtle example of the above. It is time to fight an enemy. We are savvy players, so we know we will need some rules to align large chunks of the physicality of combat, but the question is how much and which chunks. Now, an example. We decide to align all of it. At the beginning of combat, we flip a coin. If it shows heads, the party wins the combat and gets what they want. If it shows tails, they lose instead, and their enemies get what they want. Hey, Magnus. What we have here is something very similar to the second example of lock picking above. It says the specifics of combat are boring and best left out. Now we can concentrate on the causes and effects of combat itself rather than the specifics of the process of combat. Doing combat this way, we don't need to worry about aiming or physiognomy or ammunition or weapon types or the reality of bodies or the drama of thrust riposte. Instead, we can concentrate on other things that are presumably more interesting to us. But what if we do care about the physical limitations of bodies and the drama of thrust riposte? Can we retain those things while leaving out other, more boring parts of combat? Well, yes. Yes, we can. All we have to do is zoom in the camera one level deeper on the fractal of play and start alighting there. So instead of make one roll for combat, we might make a roll for this element of combat that we want to remove. And then in the example, he's got basically insert BX combat rules here. And there's an editorial note here. Please don't expect me to restate huge chunks of BX. You're familiar. Honestly, the combat in any edition of D&D will do. Okay, I'm going to skip over that because basically saying, hey, look, I'm not going to repost basically the BX rules for you. So here we have an example of a set of rules that leaves the fact of combat intact, but picks and chooses from among the realities of combat, leaving behind only what it deems interesting or necessary for whatever reason. Example 3 has none of the specifics of combat. Example 4 does. But example 4 is not the same as example 1. It is doing a huge amount of elision. Example 1, which was picking the lock by talking through it, basically playing the whole thing through. Example 1 would have no rules in the gamebook at all. Example 4 would have an incredible number of rules in the gamebook. That's because the elision in example 4 is happening at a lower or closer or smaller level. It's more granular. And here's the deep insight, if there is one. Whatever level of the fractal we're alighting on, in this example, one level below the fact of combat, that is us curating the experience of the thing one level up, in this case, combat. We are making play about combat here to some degree, or rather about some specific qualities of combat. In this way, example 4 becomes a commentary on combat and a set of arguments about what is interesting about combat. Example 4 is concerned with the uncertainty of blows, but it's not concerned with why a blow hits or does not. Therefore, it says basically flip a coin to hit. If it didn't say there's something similar, we might find ourselves describing the precise pose and position of our characters' bodies and the specific build and fit of their armor and the exact shape and angle of their weapon in order to work out in the fiction and physics of our play whether or not we hit. But just like lock picks on pins, that seems boring or unimportant to many groups, so they roll it instead. They don't lose the drama of a huge swing that doesn't quite land. They lose the work to get there. Similarly, where combat in example 3 always lasts the same amount of time, mere seconds, and always has the same beats, none, Combat in example 4 can be dynamic. Example 4 combat can be quick or protracted, energetic or sluggish. We can watch the tides turn dramatically. We can have Cinderella stories and David and Goliath stories. These are things elided by example 3, which is the one where you basically flip a coin for the entirety of combat. Maybe the game that uses example 3 doesn't want these things. Maybe those players find those things boring and unimportant. That's great. They can align them with rules. Wait, so games are about what their rules are about? Well, yes, kinda, but definitely not in the way TTRPG designers tend to insist. If you look at examples 3 and 4, I think it's plain to see that making a game about X is not merely a matter of writing a bunch of rules that have to do with X. Instead, we make rules about everything that is not X. We use rules to remove parts of X from play, thereby presenting a vision of X that is inherently ideological and opinionated. That opinion can be considered and thoughtful, or it can be slapdash and haphazard. And without the framework of rules allied or something similar, I suppose, though I obviously prefer this framing, which of those we end up with is out of our control. This is a method for understanding what we're actually doing when we write rules, the formal mechanism by which a game book can make an argument about a subject. I contend that rules allied represents a method that is unique to tabletop role playing games and is therefore perhaps the most important method available to us as writers of tabletop role playing books. But that's another essay. The takeaway here, if there is one, is this: we use rules to remove some of the trees so we might better see the forest. We argue through negation. Okay. Brian Smith says, this is some academic esotericism. It is a bit. It's an interesting concept. I'm not sure I'm 100% on board with it. I could certainly see when you run through his examples how it kind of makes sense. But I think there was, and I don't know if I actually did it on the stream, there was a really good piece somebody wrote about playing, I think it was Boot Hill. And the fact is that all these gameplay elements came out of things that there were no rules about. Because there was no rules about them, it forced them, if you wanted to do something, to really dive in and do it, right? There's no rule about lock picking. So if you don't invent a rule, you instead are going to dive in and start messing around. Now, lock picking is something that's a little bit outside of most people's frames of reference, other than looking at the little tools that you see on TV or something and imagining kind of how they work. We don't really know. But in the case of Boot Hill, it was a lack of social skills and all these different things that, okay, I want to go convince the mayor to do something. Well, I have to actually go convince the mayor. There's no roll of die to do it. There's no whatever. I got to go actually do all this stuff. And in that case, in that instance, it seemed like the lack of rules opened up a whole bunch of concepts that they just had to kind of play out, which I think I thought maybe I did read on stream. I don't remember. Was I feel like I did, but my memory's faulty. Opened up all kinds of stuff. But it's an interesting way to look at rules when you're either reading rules or you're thinking about writing rules, whether you're writing a system or you're just writing your own house rules about by making all these rules, kind of what are you doing, kind of thing. Though I do think sometimes that rules can actually, I think there's another element here. And again, this is not a thought out, fully thought out point of view. But I think there's oftentimes we might align out something and that the rules force us to go in deeper. For example, in some scenarios where you're forced, I want to say this is something that like Burning Wheel, where you would have really set a set procedure for negotiations that would force you in all these different steps. That might have you actually drill down into a procedure in a way you might not before because you're not thinking about it that way. So you're like, oh, okay, give me some horses. And you just say, oh, well, the Lord kind of likes you, so he gives you some horses. Whereas something like Burning Wheel, it might be like, okay, give me some horses. And then I got to come up with some counter. And then we got to go through some kind of 7-round counter and offer and sub offer, or, counter offer sort of thing. And that forces actually to go deeper in than you would. Now, it's not maybe as deep as you would go if you wanted to get really deep into the negotiation aspect, but it might cause you to go deeper than you were already. So there probably is something there too. But anyway, that was that whole article, which I think it is good. I think it's good, kind of and thought provoking and interesting. Like I said, I haven't thought about it super deeply. I'm not sure I agree with it 100%, but I think it's a useful thing to think about. And let me just catch up here. A whole bunch of stuff happening in the chat. Brian Smith's responding to Dave. Oh, I think that's about the skills. I do want to get to the skills question, but I want to read because that article I read that article basically to get back to this article. So let me read that one, and then we can get to Dave's question about, or his comment, or this discussion point about skills. Okay, so now we have that context. Hopefully, we get back to this article at Draw the Rest of the Owlbear about you can't elide what doesn't exist, and he does summarize from the other article, which I'll just read it because it's part of the article. But I thought it would be better to get the full Monty, so to speak. Jared Sinclair says rules allied. In general, I agree. For those not familiar and who don't want to read the whole post, which we did, I'll summarize briefly with one of Jared's own examples. Think about picking a lock in an RPG. If you wanted, and everyone at the table knew enough about how lock picking works in real life, you could resolve that entire process just by describing it in detail. The ref could decide what type of lock it is and how the mechanism works. The players could describe exactly how they use their tools to examine and work with it, what motions they make, and the ref could describe how each motion moves each pin or whatever the other part of the mechanism. If you know enough, you don't even need to roll any dice. Maybe I have my suspicions about that, but that's a subject for another post, or rely on any set mechanics beyond what you all know about how to pick a lock. Let me see if I can zoom in. Am I already? What am I at now? Okay. Oh, that's probably good. Okay. Of course, most of us don't know nearly enough about how lock picking works to do that. I sure as F don't. Luckily, we don't have to, because instead of going through the whole process of describing every detail, we can just say roll 1d6, add your lock picking skill bonus. If you get a 5 or higher, you do it. This rule aligns the true process of picking the lock. It takes away the full detailed complexity of picking the lock and replaces it with something simpler, quicker, and easier for most of us to understand. Depending on the desires of your group and your game, this might or might not be a good thing. In OSR gaming, we place a lot of value on player skill over character skill. By using rules to align what happens in the fiction, we take some of that load off the players to know how things work in the fictional world and apply that knowledge and put more of that load onto the characters. Every game and group will have its own ideal balance of what to align and what to play out in full. Jared's argument in the strong form is that this is all rules can do. They cannot create or inspire or evoke, only align. Broadly speaking, I agree. Every rule we set for our game simplifies some part of the fiction. However, I believe Jared makes an important oversight. The strong form of rules allied presumes that everything in the game fiction has a real world referent. Picking a lock is something that can happen both in the fiction of our game and in real life. We can assume, unless told otherwise, that it works the same in the fiction as it does in real life. When we then apply a rule to the fiction for lock picking, we ally that process. It is implicitly the real world process of picking a lock that our rules are eliding, not the fictional one. But our fiction doesn't always have to refer to real life. The fiction can create new things wholly from imagination. Rules can't elide magic. Magic doesn't have a referent in reality. When we say my wizard casts magic missile, they aren't doing something a person can do in real life. The interaction cannot happen if there isn't a rule to say a wizard can cast magic missile. Now, technically, we can assume that there's some illusion of the fiction happening. We probably imagine that in the fiction, there's a whole lot going on when we say our wizard casts magic missile that we aren't bothering to describe in detail. We might have an idea of what some of those details look like, or we really might not care at all. But I argue that when we talk about rules eliding, the illusion of the fiction isn't what really matters to us. It's the illusion of the real world reference. The reason we care about rules eliding is because when they do, they're shifting the balance of skill and knowledge away from the players and towards the characters. We want to be careful and thoughtful about what we elide because we want to make sure we leave things in the hands of the players that we want to be there. If we want to run a game that challenges the player's skill at creative logistics, we don't want a rule that says roll 1d6 to figure out how you get the wagon load of treasure down the mountain to town. We want them to figure that ish out and explain it. But when it comes to magic, to interactions that exist only in the fiction, players can't know anything about them until they hear them explained. We can't make a game that tests the player's skill at magic without reference to game rules because magic isn't the thing the players can be skilled at. I'll leave aside discussion of real occult practices as not really related to how magic is used in most games. Now, you can argue, but when you establish magic in your fiction, it's not necessarily rules creating that magic, it's the fiction. They're not the same thing. In this case, they are, unless you really are establishing how magic works in your fiction down to the last detail, which is impossible, and then creating simpler rules to elide that complexity. However, you establish it, your explanations are always leaving something out. So, yes, maybe in that sense, your rules are eliding the truth of magic in your fiction, but at that point, who cares? How is it useful to talk about rules eliding something that can't exist without the rules to begin with? This ties into another thing I've been wanting to talk about. When you play at the world, your setting is your system. Hoping to have another post for that ready sometime soon. I think Rules Allied remains a useful lens for thinking about modeling real world interactions through game rules. But when it comes to interactions that are wholly fictional, things characters can't do at all unless something in the fiction establishes them as possible, I think the argument breaks down. You can't elide something that doesn't exist, not in any way that matters. Whew. Okay. So I think the thing I would add here to this, what I think is interesting, and I think this is right, an interesting thing, right? We don't have magic in our real world. So while how can we align it in the sense of taking away details when we don't know those details? And I think the other thing I would say that maybe is similar to this is the rules can indicate a what level of knowledge you need. So if we say that we want to align away lock picking specifics because most people don't know that much about lock picking. At the same time, you can make a set of rules that require some knowledge of lock picking, just not everything. And at that point, the rules may be aligning something, but they're also enforcing something so that it's not going to be as simple as roll d6. It might be that you have to pick a tool and then or two tools or some combination of tools in some order. And those things will, depending on the lock you're looking at, will have some interaction with that, whatever that rule is that you're rolling to figure out if you picked the lock or not. So in that case, yes, the rules are still eliding some part of lockpicking, but they're also enforcing some part of lockpicking that you probably wouldn't have had beforehand. So there's an interesting kind of balancing there part, right? Because we can get very general, we can get very basic with something on one hand, just say roll a die and it's done, or we can dive into it. And once we start to dive down in those details, there are people who are not going to have players, referees, anybody who's not going to have that amount of knowledge. And maybe that's where you get into kind of that levels of crunch thing where you can have a combat that is super crunchy that's going to get into all kinds of tactics that potentially people aren't going to have knowledge in real life. But of course, it's still eliding some parts of combat because it's inevitable that you're going to elide some parts of combat. So there's some interesting stuff here. I thought it was interesting. Whew. Okay. A lot going on in the chat here. So that's the article, but where is Dave's original thing here? Because Dave had a good, let's see, question, comment. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to post it. So Dave said, can I catch opinions on skills or no skills for a game? How do you guys feel about things like an athletic skill versus just rolling a strength check or a lock picking skill, just versus just rolling a dex check? All right, so that's a really good question. I mean, I don't think there's one answer. I think where you're going to come out a bit is there's all kinds of there's implications. There's implications here, right? So when you're using attribute checks, roll under attribute, which I've done quite a bit in BX. I think it's very simple. You're rolling, the part of my thing why I like it is you're rolling for these attributes. Don't you think you ought to kind of use them for some things? I think they can help enforce. Because I look at them as your genetics in a sense, right? This is kind of what you were, right? This is the form you have. This is what you've got. This is your kind of potential. How can you use it? So if you have, obviously, if you have really low stats across the board, that's going to stink. But I think most times you've got, some are pretty good, some are not that great. And you sort of will lean into the ones you're good at because you're just going to know from the dice that, oh, yeah, okay, if I have a 10 in wisdom and I have a 6 in intelligence, which I take to me more knowledge, learning, education, not actual intelligence kind of thing, then I'm going to lean towards into kind of intuitive stuff and not so much into that kind of knowledge, education based stuff. And I think that is good. But it comes down to also this concept of kind of your niche protection or how do you deal, right? You have a thief in your game. If you make picking a lock a dex check, how does that work? How does that work with the thieves if you have a thief class in your game? You can do it depending on how you do it, right? And be like in something like the problem in like a D&D type game of the BX nature is you say, okay, for thieves, for picking locks, it's I don't know. What is it? Let's see. Hold on a minute. I can tell you because I happen to have my little binder of BX. I know that showing a blank binder. Here we go. I got BX right there, pal. So if you're a first level thief, anyone want to guess? Anyone want to take a crack before I look it up? I can't trust you guys. You guys all cheat anyway. So let's see, a thief picking locks, first level. Oh yeah, here we go. A whopping 15%. By the book, open locks for a thief, 15%. Now, it probably doesn't matter that much if in your campaign you don't have thieves, then you can kind of ignore it. But if you have a thief that's 15% lock picking, well, what do you do when the fighter wants to pick a lock? One, you could just say, sorry, man, it's a no go, right? No can do. Um, RBG Grandma says disadvantage for non thieves. Sure, that's another way to do it, right? But just by the book, if you give somebody a roll under decks for lock picking skills, suddenly the thief is like, well, like, what am I doing here? Or even in the same campaign, but say a different party. Like, why would I be a thief if I had if I have a you're giving me a 50% chance to pick this lock as a thief, but if I were just playing my fighter from the last game, I would have had a roll under decks. And maybe even my fighter didn't have great decks, but it's still better than 15. I mean, having rolling 15% is the equivalent of having a 3 in your dexterity, right? If you're rolling a d20, if you're rolling as a flat d20, that 15% basically, if you're going to do it as roll under or equal to, an attribute would be the same as having a dex of 3. So think about how that's kind of now. I'm not saying that people are going to start, as RPG Graham already is, kind of posting fixes for this, but my point is that that sort of roll under attribute system doesn't really work well if you're going to have classes that have a skill, if there's overlap between a class skill and what you would roll that roll under attribute. Just the odds and stuff just don't make it. You'll have a hard time working it out. Now I'm not saying there aren't solutions, because there are. You could give the thief both. You could give the thief 15%, and then also their whatever their roll under decks. You could figure out, if you figure out the mathiness of it. Like I said, 20 is pretty simple. Each face is basically a 5%. So you could see that, oh, okay, there are 15% plus 3, whatever. It's not that way in the book, but you could do that out. Like, you can figure it out. It's not an insurmountable problem, but it is a problem when you're trying to match these two things, because often they won't work very well, and they don't match. Now, it doesn't really matter with the cleric, let's say, because say turn undead doesn't have fighters can't turn undead no matter what. So there's no conflict there. But with something like a thief, there can be a conflict. So if you don't have those things, if you don't have a thief in your game, if you don't have, then I'm fine with the roll under attribute if you're not going to have it. But when you start mixing and matching, it can get a little bit weird, especially if you, like you said, your scales are different. That was a big kind of, I'd say probably the biggest issue with BXs and those games, and I know Beckme made it even worse, was like the thief skills are just not that good. They're just not good. And someone's gonna look at that and say, boy, at first level, I have a 15% chance. Like, it's like on its face, it's like, that's terrible. I'm supposed to be a thief, kind of thing. And it just starts to fall down a bit. However, if you were running, say, white box or something, and there is no thief, pre Greyhawk kind of deal, or you do the work to kind of convert the thief thing in there, then you could probably use it pretty well. Though, you might find that some folks are advantaged. Personally, when I'm looking at more skill based stuff, I really want to. So, like, how I've come around to it now is like with my do anything D6 and that kind of system sort of thing I'm working at. It's more, I'm much more, I am more in line. I'm trying to push the importance of having the skill as opposed to having the raw dexterity. Because the other thing I don't like is dexterity, for example, is it's just too broad. It means, what, you're faster, you have better hand-eye coordination, like all this stuff. Like, to me, if you go look at, I don't know, go to a locksmith, someone who's really good at picking locks, or somebody who just you don't have to be, just because you're quick doesn't mean you have great hand-eye coordination. Just because you have good hand-eye coordination doesn't mean you're gonna be a great lock pick. And I would rather lean into the fact that the skill of someone who invested in training their lock picking skill over the fact of someone being fast. So I tend to want to separate them more now. I like roll under attribute when I'm just kind of playing loosey goosey and it doesn't really matter. And then, yeah, roll under attribute is just easy. You don't need anything else. Just go. And I find it works fairly well. But when I want to kind of drill into, which I feel like I'm more into now, drilling into the kind of capabilities of characters, is I want to lean more into that skill bit. Did you take a, if you're using backgrounds, like, do you have a background of this thing? Were you trained in this? Like, how are you in kind of investing in this stuff and then reward that. And I also like the archetypes you can get because sometimes the best lockpick is like a frumpy, slow person, not quick and agile. They're not like you don't have to be Legolas to be a great lockpick or a great pickpocket. In fact, probably most of those guys who make their livings in those sorts of things are not Legolas like in any way, shape, or form. They're like everyman. That's partly by design. That's how you're able to get places and just walk around, is you don't stand out because you're super fast or super whatever. So that's kind of where I lean into it. I think that the thing is you kind of pick one and then you just sort of. I think it's easier if you sort of stay in that lane. If you're going to go with role under attributes, then figure out everything how it relates to role under attributes. But because, like I said, there's can be some weirdness when suddenly you're switching, switching back and forth. Let's see. Magnus says, I think you either design your game with classes, combat and skill is more flavor, or class equals a skill package and combat is flavor. Um, yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, yeah, combat is the one that's usually the most fraught because it's kind of the life or death thing, right? Um, but yeah, so there's where I come out on that one, Dave. This is the last of my what is this? Blood orange tangerine spinner for the working man. Ian says that their system uses roll under, but uses skill proficiencies in other situations to toss on plus or minus, I think, or equals plus minus with different die types. That's cool. Okay, yeah, plus minus. That's cool. Yeah, there are many ways you can skin the cat, right? I do like the kind of fast flow of roll under attribute. I think for newer people or people who aren't interested in getting into skills, and like I said, if you don't have any classes, you're playing a bunch of fighters or something else, it's great because you can just go. But when you start to mix in, I guess it's really the thief. I mean, well, depending on what at least classically, right? Like BX or something like that, it's the kind of the thief that sort of mucks up the works, which is why people have been arguing about the thief since 1974 or five or whenever Greyhawk came out, six maybe, because of that very thing. Is that the thief sort of upset the apple cart with a lot of things, and it was never really addressed in a way because all that stuff was just kind of left up to you. Talk about rules eliding, right? They just kind of were saying, "Hey, climbing all that stuff, hey, you figure it out, walk it through, do whatever you want." And suddenly the thief comes out, and they have rules for it, but it's never really made clear how the thief rules, how that does that apply to everybody else in some way. Like they never really brought them together in terms of okay, now we have rules for climbing for thieves, but how does that work with other classes? And it's until they kind of, I guess, unified everything. Was it really third edition? I don't know if they did. Maybe they did it earlier in second, where they kind of brought everything and said, nope, everything's going to be in this kind of lockstep. It was kind of a potential issue. Brian Smith wants to know how to run a truly bombastic and exciting wizard duel. Well, you know what, Brian Smith, I don't know if you're being facetious or not, but I actually there is a article about that I had. I think I had loaded up somewhere. Hold on a minute. No, no, no. Yes. Oh, it's from the same article. Well, looky dar. So this one, same blog. Draw the Rest of the Owlbear has a blog. Whoops, yeah. Nope, that's the wrong one. Blog article on mage duels. So let's read what they have to say, and then we can put in our own 2 cents. Oh, Brian, so look at that. So it was not, you did not see ahead. You were just on that wavelength. Okay, so let's see what Draw the Rest of the Owlbear blog has to say, and then we can go from there. Magic duels are cool. I want them in my game. What should they look like? They can basically be anything. The way they'll look will be informed by what spells are available in the game and how they work. As a thought exercise, I started looking over the OSC spell list to see how a theoretical wizard duel might play out, following those mechanics as provided, so I could see how one might want to change them to achieve a different result. I quickly realized that when it comes to wizard duels and small scale tactical skirmish combat, the standard use case, the OSC spells are broken as F. The theory: you have six spell levels, theoretically of increasing power. All spells take one slot of their level and are cast the same way. One full round, damage interrupts, must have a free hand and be able to speak. This naturally implies that that spells of the same level should be roughly equivalent in power since they have the exact same casting requirements. Now let's see if that assumption bears out. The problem: hypothetical wizard duel. Two magic users of the same level both know every spell they're about able to cast. I take a look at the classic first level spell list, and these in particular jump out at me as the spells most relevant to wizard duels. Though, of course, a creative wizard might be able to come up with a use for others. So, Charm Person, neutralize a single target by making them friendly on a failed save, unreliably more and more so as the game progresses and saves get better. Light, hamper or neutralize a single target by blinding it on a failed save, unreliably. And then Magic Missile, harm a single target reliably, no save can't miss. Protection from evil, prevent harm unreliably, makes evil creatures' attacks and spells less likely to hit you, but does nothing to weaken their effects when they do. And situationally, depending on the alignment of your enemies, shield, prevent harm unreliably. Better AC means better chance of no damage, but no reduction in damage when somebody does hit you. And sleep, neutralize multiple targets reliably, no save until higher levels, at which point it becomes entirely ineffective. Okay, so I think that's the list. Sleep is vastly overpowered compared to other first level spells. This isn't necessarily a problem. You might want some variation in the power of spells at a given level. I think that makes things more interesting. In Magic the Gathering, this principle is called the Jedi curve. When designing a card that costs a given amount to play, the design team maps the standard power of a card that costs at that cost as the Jedi curve and tries to fill each set with cards that sit above, below, and right on that curve. This is supposed to reward players for learning what cards are good for their cost and seeking out those cards to build their decks around. Similarly, if wizards in your game world know that some first level spells are better than others, they'll be motivated to quest in search of those spells and compete with other wizards to secure copies. However, I think something like the traditional sleep is probably too overpowered. Its existence basically destroys the possibility of wizard duels even being a thing. Everyone will just become a contest to see who can cast sleep first and win instantly until you get to duels between wizards with more than 4+1 hit dice who are just immune to it, which also isn't interesting because it means they can just ignore it completely from then on without having to exercise any kind of competence. What is it about sleep that makes it so broken? I set out to understand better. The goal: make an ideal Jedi curve for my own spell system that manages to account at least somewhat for the tactical infinity of OSR play as compared to the strict mechanics of Magic. So it seems like he's going to get. I felt like this was going more about wizard duels, but then it seems like it's going down this curve about analyzing spells. I think I would go kind of a whole other way, a whole other method. I think so. If I wanted, and I will go further and read this, but I kind of have this in my brain, so I'll get it out here. I don't know if it's a wonderful idea ultimately. This would be my first pass. Is that if you were dueling another wizard, like you're declaring or a challenge, like there had to be one thing where you declare kind of a challenge, and then maybe the other party accepts the challenge. Like we're gonna wizard duel, right? So in a sense, you're gonna be not necessarily off to the side of the battlefield, but you're kind of in your own. You're kind of locked in on each other, at least from your perspective. Like everything else is sort of dim. The lights will kind of dim, and then the other other person would brighten up. Now, I'm conceiving of it as a duel. Literally, there's just two of you going at it. I'm not sure if this would how I don't know how this would scale if you had multiple wizards or if the teams were uneven in some way. But that's kind of so that's my first thing. It's like, you see a wizard outside the battlefield and you guys decide like pew, pew, like we lock eyes and like yeah, and then you kind of go. And all of a sudden you're sort of in this wizard duel sort of thing. At that point, I would not worry about the spells. You could probably have some fun with the schools of the spells or some other way of categorizing it or something like the effects. And maybe you could make, if you really wanted to get into it, you could do some kind of rock, paper, scissors effect, right? Damaging spells versus enchantment spells versus whatever spells. And then you could literally have this thing where you're trying to pick this kind of spell you want to use up because you're using your spell sheet. I presume what you have memorized, but I'd even be okay if probably a different variant where you're just worried about the slots. But you're looking at which spell slot you want to use and what kind of spell you want to use, and then not really worrying about its as on paper effect. Like, oh, fire dart sends a dart of fire or magic missile. That part, I'm not worried about that too much. It's really more about I'm going to use a damaging spell on a second level spell, a second level damaging spell here. as my opener. And the other wizards may be thinking, okay, and let's just say from their perspective, if we were doing this like as a teaching exercise, and you say, okay, in our little rock paper scissors type scenario, the damaging spell is going to beat a enchantment spell. An enchantment spell, I'm gonna say like enchanting, like charm and things like that. Like not adding bonuses to stuff, but like you're enchanting someone, right? Like an enchantress enchants someone. So damaging spells will defeat enchantment spells, but I would say it would be you'd be looking at the level. So if I had a high level enchantment spell, I could maybe it's like double. So if I cast a second level damaging spell, if I were to cast as a defender a fourth level enchantment spell, I could defeat it. But then you have to also look at, well, what is the one? Okay, so if right damaging spell beats enchantment spell, maybe you say, oh, I don't know, what's another kind of spell? A conjuring spell maybe beats a damaging spell. And so you have this little thing. And so, one thing you have to do is figure out which schools. And I know there's more than three schools. You could probably figure out some wheel of, oh, you did whatever. But basically, certain things, certain types of spells are more effective than other spells, but also weaker than other spells. Two other types of spells use the spell levels and equalizer. So if you're like you only have damaging spells, but they're high level, you can still, if you're assuming you're a high level wizard, you can still burn one, knowing that it's going to be really hard for that other character to maybe defeat it. And of course, you could get into like you don't know, we don't know what level. Like I have a level 4 whatever spell, but I'm going to cast a level 1 right now, and then goes from that, and then you're just eating up spell slots. I'm not sure exactly how we do damage in that point. If it would just be whatever comes through, you could make some kind of rule. Whatever breaks through does some kind of damage. Again, I wouldn't want to base it on the dice of the thing itself, like, because that would make kind of fireball sort of overpowered and spells like that. But I would be more like, okay, you cast a level 4 damaging spell. I was only able to defend with a single level spell that whatever, just that's kind of like it'll work, but it's not great. So that means 3 levels come through. Maybe at that point you roll 3d6. Maybe you go directly against my intelligence or something. And then if I get down to 0, then I'm basically made kind of vegetableized, and then real damage burns in. Something like that. But that's kind of how I would do it. So it's going to be really, you're going to use up a lot of resources doing this, obviously, because each round you guys are casting different spells at each other as it's going on. I think it would be kind of cool. There's a little bit of a different sort of, I don't know, offense defense kind of thing. RPG Grandma says fire no fireballs for everyone. Ryan Smith says the funny thing is that two wizards casting spells at each other would almost be so complicated you have to simplify the whole process down to only the meaningful decisions. I mean, yes, that or you just have the spells go off. I mean, the other way to do it, which was kind of the 5th edition version, is just counterspell. That you're burning a spell, then the other person burns a counterspell potentially, or not. Like that would be it. Um, right? That would so either you're gonna I don't know what quite what you're casting. I can counterspell you, or I can believe that I can eat that spell so that I can cast something else. That would be the other way to do it, but that doesn't seem to be as fun. I kind of like the idea of like, okay, we're gonna go off and have our own special battle. Like I remember, I love Big Trouble in Little China, and there's a point towards the end of the movie where Lopan and Egg Shen basically have a wizard battle, and they're all fighting in that sort of wedding ceremonial space, and Lopan uh, and Egg Shen kind of spot each other, and like Egg Shen's got these gems and these two beams coming. One, what I think Lopan's beam is red, and I think what is it? Egg Shen's is blue or something. When they meet, they morph into warriors, and they're hitting each other, and then finally one wins. That's kind of how I would like to have it be, and not just be like I'm just dropping my spells on you, but I would get it. Brian Smith says, need some specific dice just for wizard duels. Yeah, I could do it. Yeah, RPG. Grandma says monster summon. Yeah, I mean, you could. Yeah, you could go outside the box, right? I'd want to allow for some outside the box stuff, but there's kind of like once you're in that. I guess I think of the duels. Once you're in that duel, you're burning through magical energy more than the spells. Like you were unleashing these spells, but in a different kind of way than what you're doing. But maybe people would say, I think the flip side I could also see with people saying, well, why would I do that? Like if I just throw a fireball on them, not in the wizard's duel, that's most likely going to kill them if I get it off, as opposed to going through the duel. Like I can kill this guy in one spell, or I can go into this other system where I'm going to be dropping a whole bunch of spells. So you need to kind of you'd have to sort that part out too, because the if the duel doesn't make sense from a resource point of view, which my version certainly does not, then no one would ever do it. Like, why would I ever agree to it? Fireball, eat that, pal. Especially in older, versions where you don't have tons of hit points. So a fireball can take out a fairly strong wizard, especially if you just roll well. Save is missed and you roll well for damage. That could be it. Fireball, fireball. So, Dave says you rock paper scissors to see whose spell goes off first. Yeah, that could be another way to do it. But I think the thing is, I'm trying to apply, or I want to. I wouldn't want to, and maybe I should. Part of me is like, I don't want to penalize a wizard in a wizard duel if they don't have a ton of combat spells, because I think what sometimes gets lost with magic using, depending on the system, of course, and the addition of the system, is the utility type spells. Like, really having read languages can be really useful situationally, or having detect magic or detect evil. And if you're in a situation where you're going to get in these, you think you're going to run into wizard duels, then it just wouldn't make sense to have non-combat spells, because you'd want to be kind of on the ready. So part of me thinks, well, you kind of want to be, you want to be kid out. But then the other part of me is that's just part of the game. It's like, always have some kind of, maybe you always want to have something, a high level spell slot with some kind of combat thing in case you run into another high level wizard. I don't know. RBG Grandma says chainmail's rules let players use spells higher than level with risk. Yeah, I think in chainmail wizards, right, but they also don't have slots, right? Chainmail wizards, and I can look it up because I've got it right here, right? They just cast spells. So it's not quite the same thing, if I'm thinking correctly. Right? So we get to wizards. And actually, wizards and chainmail are fairly strong anyway. So they'll fight as 2 armored foot or 2 medium horse if mounted, and wizards can handle magical weaponry. So they're not, they're not very disadvantaged at that point. However, their chief prowess lies elsewhere. Wizards can become invisible and remain so until they attack. They can see in darkness. They affect friendly and enemy morale, as do superheroes. They throw deadly missiles, and wizards cast terrible spells. Wizards are themselves impervious to normal missile fire, but if they are struck by a missile from an enemy wizard, they must score 7 or better with 2 to survive. So, in terms of missiles, a wizard could throw either of 2 types of missiles, and you select before play either fireball or lightning bolt. And then, so wizards in the game, I mean, wizards in chainmail are basically like 8th level or 9th level magic users. So it's you can't really compare the two in terms of, unless you're comparing end of game wizards, and they can do things that you just can't do in terms of once you get into actual D&D, which is basically they have invisibility at will. So they attack, they could just launch off as many lightning bolts and fireball or fireballs. Not both, they can't have both, but they can do whichever one whenever, every round in chainmail, at will. So it's and they can use magic weapons and stuff. It's they are they're Gandalf the Whiting it over there. So it's a whole different ballgame. But I know that Bandits Keep did a video on Wizard Duels. It would be really interesting to maybe watch his thing and kind of see what's people are thinking about it, because it is kind of neat. I kind of like my idea, but only in isolation is when I start to bring in other things like, well, why wouldn't you just cast Fireball if you had it, or Lightning Bolt or something else? Then it's like, yeah, I'd probably need to figure out what makes. I mean, the one. I mean, I could see where maybe if you were on one side, you might want to go in the duel, because it basically prevents the other wizard from hitting other people. Because when you kind of in the duel, you're locked them down. So maybe the one reason why you might want to duel is because you get to lock down the other guy's wizard until the duel's done, and you're probably going to both exhaust your magic powers by the end of it. So maybe you go, if you're a much stronger wizard than the other person, that maybe it works like this, right? If you're a much stronger wizard than your opponent, if you know it, right? It's not something you kind of then you wouldn't duel them because it just locks you down and it's giving them more. It's putting them more on an even playing field, other than the fact of the spell slots and blah blah blah. But it puts them in a more even playing field where you could probably just eliminate them with one spell. It might take you a couple of rounds and more spells to do this. Okay, if you're the same level, it might make sense to duel if you want to keep the other wizard from fireballing your side. You're not alone. You've got your minions and the henchmen and your knights and your fighters, your parties over there. You got another wizard over here. If you duel them, and while you're dueling, they can't fireball your squad. And that maybe you'll whatever, however many people you have, whatever, the kind of, I presume the levels of your own men. So you're like, I'm gonna lose a whole bunch of my foot soldiers if I let this cat just fireball me. So I'm gonna duel them. And then the other wizard, if they're about the same level, will probably be like, yeah, man, I'll duel you too, because I don't want you fireballing my side. So then that may make sense. And of course, if you're a weaker wizard than the other one, if you can get them to duel you, it might kill you, but it might keep the wizard from killing everybody, at least for a while. So maybe there actually is a pretty good built-in calculus for the wizard duel thing. I will have to ponder it some more. Hey, RPG Grandma. Well, thanks for the comments, and thanks for hanging out as long as you did, and good luck with work. Dave says, maybe you have each player roll a die, add your modifier to the die, then you figure out the difference, and the apex of their magic beam moves a bit towards one wizard or the other. Yeah, I mean, I think that part you can visualize, I think, any way you want to. I don't even know if you need dice for that. I could just as easily just use the difference in levels. And then, like I said, you're going to have this, like, one type of spell is stronger than another one. And I think between that kind of rock, paper, scissors bit, and then the difference of the spell slots you're casting, I'm not even sure you need dice for that part of it. But this is just me looking at it super off the top of my head, right? Let's see. Dave says, and Dave also says, any wizard can lock the other into a duel, which stops both sides from casting their spells. Right? Yeah, I think I would have it be accepted. I don't think I could just let, like, if you're a 10th level wizard and some first level, hedge mage comes up to you and says, I challenge you to a duel, that you're stuck. I think you have to accept. But as I'm thinking about it, there are good reasons, depending on how you think about your opponent, to when you would want to duel them versus when you would want to not. And that might be enough. Like I said, that might be enough. It might not be something where you have to duel. You just make that choice. And there are going to be situations where it makes sense to duel, situations when it might be even in your favor to duel, and situations where you're going to refuse because you feel like you're going to knock them out of the park anyway. Brian Smith says, love those stakes. Even if I lose the duel and get roasted, I can have a death scene and tell my crew I held off the wizard as long as I could. Now go onward to victory. Yeah, that's totally something you could do. You're a low-level wizard, but you're able to put on, cloak yourself and something that makes folks think you're a high-level wizard. And so when that really high-level wizard does show up, you duel them, the wizard accepts. And you could also have an alignment bit. You could use morale and reaction rolls and, all kinds of, you can work in, you can lock it in with other mechanics, pull them into it to kind of help that choice. But yeah, that might be enough to do it, because certainly there are definitely situations where I think locking down the enemy wizard is going to be good. And then other situations where you're, as the wizard, are not going to want to be locked down. Could just be a circumstantial thing. Like, oh yeah, I could, but we're being overwhelmed or something. So I don't want to, I need to blow up all these guys. I can't spend my time with you. And I'm just going to have to risk that you're going to blow up my guys or not. And then other times you'll want to take the duel. The wizard says, maybe wizard duel is a spell that you cast to engage the other wizards so that they could roll to shrug it off and ignore it. I mean, you could, Dave, but I'm actually, to be honest, I'm actually okay with just leaving it up to the players. Like, I think once the players are aware of, as Brian Smith called them, the stakes, and I as a GM are aware of the stakes, then I can just make that choice. And when it comes to trying to see, do I know how high level this wizard is, whatnot, then I just have to, if I'm an NPC, maybe I use a morale roll or something, because obviously as the referee, I'm going to know pretty much what level my the player character is. So I'd probably want to roll a die or something for that, just to simulate, or use some other thing to simulate the fact that they don't know what they are, but maybe they look the part or not, which could work to the player's advantage, right? If you're a high level wizard, but you want to dress like a slob and kind of go in disguise, that might be, you could, like a hustling pool, you could hustle some wizards that way. And then as far as the PC, it's kind of the same. I will describe my wizard. Maybe he seems to be like a real Merlin type, but maybe he's not actually a Merlin type. Maybe that's his I don't Yeah, I don't know that I would. I mean, obviously, you could, whatever you want for your games. I don't know that I would need the or want the compelling part of it, but that's me. Brian Smith says, I think there is a spell called Compel Duel in 5e or an effect or something. Usually doesn't apply to wizards, though. Most if you're getting big guys to chase tanks. Yeah, I mean, you could totally make up that spell. I don't think I need it. I think I like the idea of you just make a choice, right? And it says something. Whoever basically puts down the challenge for the duel, it all kind of says something about them, what they want to do, which can be another character trait. Maybe you're a wizard who's like a gunfighter, who's always looking for the other gunfighter to prove themselves, and you want to duel because you want to take them down that way, or you're not, right? So there's a lot of neat things you can actually play around with the idea. I don't think the compel part is something I would want to delve into, but that's like I said, that is me. Okay, let's see the rest of this article here. So now they're analyzing, as Dave says, it could be an honor thing. Totally, honor, reputation. Are you lawful? And maybe if you're lawful, then if you want to get close to compelling, you can say, hey, if you're lawful and someone challenges you, it's kind of a thing to do it. It's kind of a not so much a lawful move to do it. I don't know. You could play around, but I think depending on, I don't know, are wizards lawful, and I don't remember. But anyway, yeah, you could do a lot of fun things with alignment and just personalities. Who does this person think they are, sort of thing. Brian Smith says it's fun. It's part of the world at large. Absolutely. Okay, so now we're back to this article where we're analyzing, doing some analysis here. So where we left off, if one recalls, was sleep being broken or so broken. So now they want to understand sleep better so they can make that Jedi curve for their own spell system. So the analysis. So we've broken down what the most directly fight-related first level spells do, how they are typically going to affect a duel. We can break down the effects of these spells into three categories of sorts, three metrics by which they can be compared. I'm going to call these effectiveness at offense or defense, scope, how many targets they affect or threats they can protect against, and consistency, how reliable the effects are. As we saw, Charm Person, for example, serves to effectively neutralize a target in a fight. It makes the target friendly, causing them to stop fighting, causing the fight to be over and the caster to win. However, it's only effective against a single target, and it's not perfectly reliable since the target can save against it. All right, now I'm switching to water here. Cool water. Based on this breakdown, I came up with a few rough scales for each of the categories. In terms of effect, we have offensive spells that hamper targets. They weaken them somehow, but not enough to take them out of the fight. Then we have spells that harm targets, bringing them closer to being out of the fight directly. Finally, we have spells that neutralize targets, taking them out of the fight in one fell swoop. Defensively, we have spells that mitigate harm to the caster, making it less severe, spells that entirely prevent harm to the caster, and finally, certain spells might exist to reflect the harm from the caster back at its source. These don't fully capture the effects of every spell that's useful in a fight, and they're not meant to. For example, you might have two spells that neutralize the target, but one might do so just temporarily, like sleep, while another makes the subject unable to fight pretty much permanently, like feeble mind. The second spell is obviously a lot more powerful in general, but in terms of effect on the balance of a single engagement, they're equivalent. In terms of scale, we have spells that affect a single target and spells that can affect a whole group. In terms of consistency, we have spells that are unreliable in their effect because the target can't save against them or some other readily available means to resist them. And then we have spells that are reliable in their effect, those that don't offer a save or any other clear means of resistance. Both of these are spectrums, of course, not binary categories. You could also maybe break spells down by duration. Like if you have a spell that weakens an enemy for just one round versus a whole fight. Some games do this, but I'm not generally inclined to do it for OSR stuff. In my opinion, when you start designing spells to work only for a certain number of combat rounds, time scale of a single fight, you're getting away from the kind of tactical philosophy OSR play usually focuses on and more crunchy skirmish wargame territory. Duration obviously matters on the time scale of an adventure or campaign, but that's not what I'm mostly concerned with when I'm trying to think about how a wizard duel might look in my game. Okay, the curve. Taking these metrics and applying them to the classic spells, I come up with this general outline of what I think a quote unquote standard spell of a given level should be able to do in a wizard duel based on classic OSR spells. This goes up to fifth level, which is kind of the break point where I like to think spells are more about affecting domain scale stuff rather than personal adventuring. All right, so the first level, Hamper a single target reliably. This could be something like a blinding light spell if the target doesn't get a save. Hamper a group unreliably. Something like a fog cloud, which has the obvious downside of also hampering your allies at close range. Harm a single target reliably. This is your magic missile, the easiest balance point to compare magical forms of attack with physical. It's a bow shot that can't be dodged, but consumes whatever resources it takes to cast a spell, often much more limited than arrows, and might be interruptible depending on if you have all your spells take a full round. Neutralize a target unreliably. I might do this as a single target version of sleep that allows a save or some other countermeasure, perhaps a droning speech that can lull an unsuspecting subject to unconsciousness, but they can stop their ears if they get wise early. Sounds a little bit like my streams. A droning speech that can lull an unsuspecting subject to unconsciousness. Block harm from a single threat unreliably. This is your standard shield, easy enough. All right, now, second level. Hamper a group reliably, your web. Harm a group unreliably, burning hands, perhaps. Blast a bunch of fools at once, but they can dodge. Block harm from a single target reliably. This could be your mirror image. A group attacking you all at once could hit all the dupes at once and isolate the real you. Third level, harm a group reliably. Here you get your fireballs and lightning bolts. Even if your opponents save, they're still getting at least somewhat effed up. Neutralize a single target reliably. Hold person, assuming either no save or a difficult one. Mitigate harm from a group reliably. Magic armor. You're tougher, but they can still get through, or it only reduces harm rather than stopping it, even when it works. Fourth level, neutralize a group unreliably. This could be a confusion. Maybe it allows a save, or maybe it's always effective. It doesn't always stop subjects from being dangerous. Block harm from a group unreliably. Protection from normal missiles fits this. Always good against arrows. Does nothing for melee weapons. Fifth level, neutralize a group reliably. This is cloud kill, with the weak enemies die outright. Block harm from a group reliably. Protection from normal weapons. Check. I actually really like this breakdown. I feel like I could use this for a bunch of stuff when I'm trying to figure out kind of ad hoc casting. This is actually really useful for that, where you can look and see, like, if you were looking at wanting to basically decouple your spell slots from your spells and kind of, or let someone just kind of cast something, using these as at least as a starting point seems like really useful. So I'm that I think is going to be really. I'm going to have to come back to that to read it more, and maybe go through the spells on my own to kind of see where things fall. And then closing thoughts. I noticed the parameters actually get narrower and narrower at each level. That might feel counterintuitive, but I actually think it makes sense. Personal scale combat is a pretty niche scenario in a good OSR game. I think a good magic system should be about much more than that overall. If there are fewer and fewer tactical niches for higher level spells in that scenario, it suggests that a greater proportion of spells at each ascending level are mainly focused on other things, operating at larger scales where the greater number of situational factors at play makes their utility harder to measure and compare. Is this useful? Actually, I would say yes, but they say, I don't know. I feel like it will be for me. Something I can look at when I want to make a new spell to get a sense of how it might or might not F up my wizard fights. Having a reference like that will help me get over my analysis paralysis. Maybe it'll be of some useful for some of you too. And I think absolutely it will. And yes, I will post this one in the link in the box. There it is, and I'll show it. There we go. It's draw the rest of the owlbear.blogspot.com /2024/02/I-cast-testicular-torsion.html. Yeah, I think that's really good. I mean, I just think that just kind of going through those spells, I mean, I feel like it's a lot of kind of thing that I've been doing. We're trying to look at, it's like, how can we block out certain effects, kind of see what kind of buckets different things fall into, so you have hamper, harm, neutralize, right? And so then you look and say, oh, hamper one, hamper a group, harm one, neutralize one, and then so on and so forth. Pack of D30s. Magnus says a pack of D30s order came. Nice. A pack of D30s. Not just one, not just two, but a pack. All right. Well, enjoy, Magnus. Post some pictures somewhere. I'm not even sure. I don't think I've ever seen a pack of D30s. I think I have one. But I got with a DCC. Is it DCC that's got the D30? I think so. I think I have one. I don't use it that much, but that's awesome that you needed a pack and you ordered a pack. Hopefully, they come in some really cool colors. 5 in a baggie. All right. Like a not a dime bag. What would that be? A nickel bag? Nickel bag of D30s? Cool. Well, look at that. We made it through an hour. Got through not that much, but I think it was definitely worth it. I feel like I mean the rules aligned stuff is intriguing to me, maybe not to other folks, but this list of kind of this spell analysis list actually I think could be quite useful. So glad I got that read. If you're here now or you watch this or listen to this the next day or so, have a great weekend. Otherwise than that, have a great rest of your day, night, or whenever you end up watching or listening to this. Uh, Dave says that Chessex makes D3s and they're hard to find, but he loves them. Yeah, I don't think I have a D3. That would be a cool one to get because I could actually use those. In any case, get yourself some D3s, D30s, all the dice you could possibly need or desire in life. And then game on, everybody. And I will talk to you later. Bye now.